He's too irresponsible to handle money," my mom shouted in court. The judge looked down at the file and said, "He manages a $35 million fund." As the courtroom erupted, my mom started fumbling. I, 32M, watched my mother's face drain of color as the judge's words hung in the air. The fluorescent lights in the courtroom buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across my mother's suddenly pale face. I sat at the defendant's table, fingers laced together, watching her fumble with the papers in front of her attorney. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine panic in her eyes. This wasn't how I imagined my Tuesday would go, but then again, nothing about the past 6 months had gone according to plan. It started with a phone call from my aunt's estate lawyer. My aunt had passed away 3 months earlier, and I'd attended the funeral with the expected grief of losing someone I'd been close to as a child. What I didn't expect was the reading of the will 2 weeks later. My aunt had left her entire estate to me. Not to my mother, her sister. Not split between us. Just me. The estate was worth approximately $800,000. A modest house in the suburbs, some investments, and her savings. My aunt had been a careful woman who'd worked as an accountant for 40 years and never married or had children. My mother was livid. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office when the will was read, watching her face transform from shock to anger to something uglier. She stood up so abruptly that her chair fell backward, and she told me I was manipulating everyone, just like I always had. The lawyer tried to calm her down, but she stormed out, slamming the door so hard the window rattled. I should have seen the lawsuit coming, but I'd been naive enough to think that even she wouldn't go that far. The petition arrived 4 weeks later. My mother was suing to have me declared financially incompetent, claiming I'd manipulated my aunt during her final years and that I was too irresponsible to handle the inheritance. She wanted the estate transferred to her, with her as the executor and conservator. I'd read through the filing in disbelief. Page after page of accusations. She claimed I had a gambling problem. She claimed I'd been fired from multiple jobs for theft. She claimed I was thousands of dollars in debt and couldn't manage my own finances, let alone a substantial inheritance. Every word was a lie, carefully crafted to paint me as a failure. The thing was, I understood where some of this came from. Growing up, I'd been the disappointment. I didn't go to medical school like she wanted. I didn't become a lawyer like my father. I studied mathematics and economics, which she considered useless degrees for people who couldn't handle real professions. When I told her I was going into finance, she laughed and said I'd be broke within a year. That was 11 years ago. I'd started at a small investment firm, working brutal hours as a junior analyst. The pay was mediocre, the work was exhausting, but I was good at it. Really good. I had an instinct for patterns in market data, for understanding risk in ways that my colleagues struggled with. Within 3 years, I'd been promoted twice. Within 5 years, I was managing a small fund. Within 8 years, I was being headhunted by larger firms. 2 years ago, I'd accepted a position as a senior portfolio manager at a mid-sized investment firm. My fund focused on sustainable technology investments, and I'd built it from $12 million to $35 million in assets under management. My clients trusted me with their retirement funds, their children's college savings, their life's work. But I'd never told my mother any of this. After years of her criticism, her dismissiveness, her constant comparisons to her friends' successful children, I'd simply stopped sharing. When she asked about work, I said it was fine. When she asked about money, I said I was getting by. I lived modestly, drove a 7-year-old sedan, rented a simple apartment. I didn't post about my life on social media. I didn't need her validation anymore, and I didn't want to give her ammunition to criticize how I spent my money or lived my life. The irony was perfect. She was suing me for financial incompetence while having no idea that I managed more money before lunch than she'd see in a lifetime. My lawyer had been thrilled when I explained the situation. She told me this would be the easiest case she'd ever won, but she wanted to do it with style. We would let my mother present her entire case first. Every false claim, every manufactured piece of evidence. We'd let her commit fully to the narrative that I was a failure. Then we'd drop the truth like a bomb. The weeks leading up to the hearing were strange. My mother had clearly done her homework in the worst way possible. She'd found an old college friend of mine who I'd lent money to years ago and convinced him to testify that I'd never been paid back, proof of my poor financial judgment. Never mind that the friend had eventually paid me back in full, and I had the bank records to prove it. She'd found a credit card statement from when I was 23 and had a brief period of high spending, conveniently omitting that it was a startup business expense that I'd paid off immediately. She'd even tracked down my landlord and tried to get him to testify that I was always late on rent. He'd refused and actually called me to warn me about her attempts. I watched her build this elaborate case against me, and part of me felt sad. This was what our relationship had become. She was so convinced of my worthlessness that she'd rather destroy me in court than accept that her sister had made her own choice. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. The judge was a woman in her early 60s with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she'd heard every excuse in the book. My mother sat with her attorney, a man who looked uncomfortable with the whole proceeding. I sat with mine, a woman named Rebecca who'd been practicing family law for 20 years and had assured me she lived for moments like this. My mother's attorney presented their case methodically. He called the friend who testified about the unpaid loan. Rebecca cross-examined him briefly, just enough to establish the dates, then let it go. He presented the credit card statements. Rebecca acknowledged them without argument. He presented character witnesses, including one of my mother's friends who testified that she'd heard I'd been fired from a job years ago. Rebecca asked a few clarifying questions, but didn't push hard. I could see my mother gaining confidence. Each piece of evidence went unchallenged. Each witness gave their testimony. Her attorney was building a narrative of a man who couldn't be trusted with money, who made poor decisions, who needed someone responsible to manage his affairs. Then my mother took the stand. Her attorney asked her to explain why she was bringing this petition. She straightened in her chair and launched into a speech about how she'd always known I was irresponsible. She talked about how I'd chosen a useless career path, how I'd never shown any aptitude for financial management, how I barely scraped by. She said my aunt had been elderly and confused, that I'd obviously manipulated her into changing her will. Then she said the line that would become the centerpiece of this whole disaster. She looked directly at the judge and said, her voice dripping with conviction, that I was too irresponsible to handle money, that I'd always been a failure, and that giving me $800,000 would be like giving a child a loaded gun. The judge had been making notes. She looked up and asked my mother if she had any direct knowledge of my current financial situation. My mother hesitated, then said she knew I worked in finance, but that she was certain I was in a low-level position, probably barely employed, likely living paycheck to paycheck. The judge asked if she'd verified any of this. My mother said she didn't need to verify what she'd known my whole life. The judge made another note, thanked her, and asked if she had anything else to add to support her petition for conservatorship. My mother said she thought the evidence spoke for itself. I was clearly incapable of managing significant assets, and she was the only responsible choice to handle the estate. Rebecca stood up for the cross-examination. She approached the stand slowly and asked my mother a simple question. Did she know what I did for work? My mother said I worked at some finance company, probably as a clerk or assistant. Rebecca asked if she'd ever visited my office. My mother said no, she'd never been invited. Rebecca asked if she'd ever asked me about the specifics of my job. My mother said she'd tried, but I was always evasive, which proved I had something to hide. Rebecca paused, then asked if she was aware that before making serious accusations in court, she had a responsibility to verify her facts. My mother's attorney objected, but the judge overruled it and told my mother to answer. My mother said she knew her own son and didn't need documents to tell her what she'd observed for 32 years. Rebecca nodded slowly, then returned to our table. She picked up a folder, walked back to the judge, and handed it to her. Then she turned to address the court. She said that she'd like to submit evidence regarding my actual financial situation and professional standing. She'd prepared a summary, verified by my employer, my professional licenses, and my banking institutions. My mother's attorney objected, claiming this was new evidence not disclosed in discovery. Rebecca countered that we had no obligation to defend against false allegations with our evidence until they'd actually made their case. We were responding to their claims, not hiding anything. The judge agreed and began reading through the folder. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of pages turning. I watched my mother's face as she tried to figure out what was happening. Her attorney leaned over and whispered something to her, but she shook her head, still confident. The judge looked up. She asked Rebecca to summarize for the record. Rebecca turned to face the courtroom and explained that I was a senior portfolio manager at a registered investment firm. I held both the Chartered Financial Analyst designation and the Certified Financial Planner certification. I was a fiduciary managing $35 million in client assets. My personal credit score was over 800. I had no debt beyond a car loan that I was paying off ahead of schedule. I had substantial savings and retirement accounts. My employer had submitted a letter praising my professional conduct and financial acumen. The judge asked my mother's attorney if he'd verified any of his client's claims about my employment or financial status before filing the petition. The attorney said he'd relied on his client's statements and the evidence she'd provided. The judge looked at my mother and asked her directly if she'd had any idea about my actual career. My mother opened her mouth, closed it, then said I'd never told her any of this. The judge asked if she'd ever actually asked or if she'd simply assumed. That's when my mother made her fatal mistake. She said that I'd clearly been hiding this from her, which proved I was deceptive and untrustworthy. If I'd really been successful, why wouldn't I tell my own mother? The judge set down her papers. She said she wanted to make something clear. This was a court of law, not a family therapy session. The question before her was whether I was financially incompetent to handle an inheritance. The evidence showed not only was I competent, but I was literally a professional whose job was to manage money for others. My mother interrupted. She said that didn't change the fact that I'd manipulated my aunt. The judge told her to be quiet. Then she said something I'll never forget. She said that what she saw here was a mother who was so invested in viewing her son as a failure that she'd rather commit perjury in court than accept reality. She said the accusations were not just baseless, they were malicious. She said that filing a frivolous conservatorship petition wasn't just a waste of the court's time. It was an attempt to use the legal system as a weapon. My mother started to argue. She said I must have forged documents or paid people off or something. She said there was no way I could be successful because she knew me. The courtroom erupted, not in my mother's favor. People in the gallery were murmuring, and I saw several people shaking their heads. My mother's attorney put his hand on her arm, trying to get her to stop talking, but she kept going, her voice getting higher and more desperate. The judge banged her gavel. She said the petition for conservatorship was denied in its entirety. Furthermore, she was sanctioning my mother for filing a frivolous claim and ordering her to pay my legal fees. She said that if my mother had spent even a fraction of the energy she'd put into this lawsuit actually trying to have a relationship with her son, she might have known who he really was. She dismissed the case. My mother sat frozen as the judge left the bench. Then she turned to look at me, and I saw something complicated in her eyes. Shock, definitely. Anger, certainly. But also something that might have been shame or regret. Her attorney packed up his briefcase quickly and left. She sat alone at her table for a long moment, and I almost felt bad for her. Almost. Rebecca touched my arm and said we should go. We walked out of the courtroom, and I could feel my mother's eyes on my back the entire way. Update 1. The aftermath of the court hearing was stranger than the hearing itself. I'd expected my mother to double down, to call me screaming, to find some new way to attack. Instead, there was silence. 2 days passed without a word. Then a week. My phone stayed quiet, and honestly, I was relieved. Rebecca called to let me know that my mother had 30 days to pay the legal fees, which totaled around $12,000. She said it was unlikely my mother would contest it given how badly things had gone. She also mentioned that she'd never seen a judge quite that blunt before, and that I should keep the court transcript because it was, in her words, a masterpiece. The inheritance process moved forward. My aunt's house needed to be sold, and the estate settled. I hired a professional estate manager to handle most of it because I didn't have the emotional bandwidth. Going through her things felt invasive, even though she'd wanted me to have everything. Then, 3 weeks after the hearing, my father called. We had a complicated relationship. He divorced my mother when I was 15, remarried, and moved to another state. We talked maybe once a month, usually brief check-ins that didn't go much deeper than weather and work. But this call was different. He asked if I was sitting down. Then he told me that my mother had called him the night before, crying, asking him if he'd known about my career. He'd been confused because he'd thought she knew. I'd told him years ago about my promotions, my fund, everything. He'd assumed I'd told her too. I explained that I'd stopped sharing anything with her after years of criticism and dismissiveness. He was quiet for a long time, then said he understood, but that maybe I should have told her anyway. Not for her sake, but for mine. I asked him what he meant. He said that by hiding my success, I'd given her power over me. I'd let her opinion matter so much that I'd shaped my entire relationship with her around avoiding it. He said that wasn't freedom, that was still being controlled by her. I told him I'd think about it, but honestly, I was angry. It felt like he was blaming me for her behavior, and I didn't want to hear it. 2 days later, I got a letter in the mail. My mother's handwriting on the envelope. I almost threw it away without opening it, but curiosity won. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten, and painful to read. She didn't apologize, not exactly. But she explained. She wrote about how after my father left, she'd felt like a failure. Her marriage had collapsed, her career had stalled, and she'd poured everything into the idea that at least her son would be successful in the ways that mattered to her. When I didn't follow the path she'd envisioned, she'd taken it as a personal rejection. She wrote that my aunt had always been the successful one, the smart one, the one everyone respected. When my aunt left everything to me instead of her, it confirmed what she'd always feared, that even her own sister thought she was a failure. She wrote that in the courtroom, when the judge read out my credentials, she'd felt like the floor was falling away. Not just because she was wrong, but because she realized she didn't know me at all. She'd been so focused on who she wanted me to be that she'd never bothered to see who I actually was. She ended the letter by saying she understood if I never wanted to speak to her again, but that she wanted me to know she was wrong. About everything. I read the letter 3 times, trying to figure out how I felt. Part of me was angry that it took a public humiliation for her to even consider that she might have been wrong. Part of me was sad that this was what our relationship had become. And a small part of me wondered if there was any possibility of fixing this. I didn't respond to the letter. Not right away. I needed time to process everything. The estate sale happened 2 weeks later. My aunt's house sold quickly, and after all the fees and taxes, the final inheritance came to just over $700,000. I deposited it into a separate investment account and tried not to think about the irony that my mother had sued to control money she'd now never see. Then Rebecca called with interesting news. My mother had paid the legal fees, but she'd done it in an unusual way. She'd liquidated her retirement savings to cover it, taking a massive tax penalty in the process. Rebecca said she'd never seen someone do that when payment plans were available, and she thought it might be my mother's way of punishing herself. I didn't know what to do with that information. Update 2. 3 months after the hearing, I finally called my mother. I'd been thinking about what my father said, about how hiding my success was its own form of being controlled. And I'd been thinking about the letter, about whether people could actually change. I didn't want a reconciliation. I didn't want to pretend everything was fine. But I also didn't want to spend the rest of my life carrying around this anger. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was cautious when she said hello, like she wasn't sure if it was really me calling. I told her I'd gotten her letter. I told her I appreciated her honesty, but that a letter couldn't fix years of damage. I told her that if she wanted any kind of relationship going forward, things would have to be completely different. She asked what I meant. I said I needed her to accept that my life was mine to live, that my choices were valid even if they weren't what she would have chosen, and that I wouldn't tolerate criticism disguised as concern anymore. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked if I could tell her about my work, about what I actually did all day. It was such a simple question, but it felt monumental. I'd spent years avoiding this exact conversation. I told her about my fund, about the sustainable technology focus, about the research I did on companies and market trends. I told her about my team, about the responsibility of managing other people's money, about the satisfaction of helping clients meet their financial goals. She listened, actually listened. Then she asked intelligent questions about risk management and diversification. I remembered that she'd worked in banking for years before I was born, before she'd stopped working to raise me. She'd always been good with numbers, and I'd forgotten that. We talked for almost an hour. It wasn't comfortable, and there were awkward pauses, but it was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. Before we hung up, she said something that surprised me. She said she'd been proud of me in the courtroom, watching the judge read out my accomplishments. Not because they made her look good, but because she'd realized I'd built something real entirely on my own, without her help or approval. I told her that had been the whole point. She said she understood that now. I'm not naive enough to think one conversation fixed everything. We still have years of damage to work through, if we work through it at all. But it was a start. The real revenge, I realized, wasn't the courtroom humiliation. It was this. I'd built a successful life without her validation, and now she had to live with the knowledge that she'd almost destroyed her relationship with me because she couldn't see past her own expectations. As for my aunt's inheritance, I did something I think she would have approved of. I used part of it to set up a scholarship fund for first-generation college students studying mathematics or economics. Students who, like me, might have family members who didn't understand or support their choices. The fund is named after my aunt, not my mother. And every time I review the scholarship applications, I think about all the kids out there who are being told they're not good enough, that their dreams are impractical, that they'll never succeed. I think about how wrong people can be about potential. And I think about how the best revenge is building something meaningful out of the wreckage.